Tevinter Nights Anthology, 3 Trees to Midnight, by Patrick Weeks. Myrion of Ventus didn't know much about Qunari. Until last week they had been an annoyance, something young soldiers went off to fight while everyone else grumbled about the taxes they paid to defend the Imperium from the savage Oxmen. That ignorance had ended in a blast of cannon fire, and in less than a day, Ventus, jewel of the Tevinter Imperium, had fallen. The Qunari had cut down anyone wearing armor. Those who were unarmored they had herded into different groups. The women, children, and elderly had quickly returned to their homes. The mages had screamed horribly as alchemical concoctions killed their minds, and left them as empty husks who stumbled along, sweeping dirt from the streets with awful vacant stares, their beautiful gold-trimmed robes dragging in the dirt behind them. The men, however, had been put into work camps. The afternoon sun was blinding after days down in the hold of the Qunari ship. Myrion squinted, his chained legs rattling as he shuffled along the line of prisoners. The sandy beach gave way to grass, and shortly thereafter to forest, where a dense cloud of black foliage hunkered over the twisted green tree trunks, as though preparing to lash out at the weeds below. "Veshante Kafas," Myrion muttered. The Qunari bastards had taken them to the outskirts of the Arlethan forest. The last of the prisoners were off the ship now, and shirtless Qunari roared at them to line up, waving swords that looked like they could chop through a horse with no appreciable difficulty. Finally, a Qunari, even larger than the others, stepped forward. His face was twisted into a scowl, his gray skin painted gold with red slashes, and his armor was a mass of knotted rope twisting around jutting spikes. His horns were jagged and swept forward to either side of his face like a low helmet. One horn had been chopped off, probably in battle, and replaced with steel. "Boss," he called, his deep voice sending a shudder through Myrion's gut. "That is what you are. Boss. Things. You do not know what is and is not. You need the guidance of the Qun to learn." "How generous of you," muttered the prisoner who had been in front of Myrion, a tall man whose accent placed him as from the south. Myrion kept his head down. If the Qunari were going to single out someone for backtalk, it wouldn't be him. "I am Bas Tar, keeper of Bas," the Qunari leader went on. "You belong to me now. Work and you live. Resist and you die. Run." A slow smile twisted across his face. "And you belong to the Huntmaster." He gestured at another Qunari warrior, this one dressed in light armor, strips of leather and drakescale bound by crisp red ropes. His face was painted with stripes of black and white. His cold stare swept down the line of prisoners as Bas Tar went on. "Run, and he will track you down, and you will suffer, as the mages of Ventus suffered." Myrion felt panic rising up in him and fought it down with a conscious effort, clearing his mind and keeping his body still. When he was certain he could look up without giving himself away, Bas Tar had moved on. "You will take axes. You will cut the trees. Prove you are useful and obedient, and you will one day earn a place in the Qun." Bas Tar looked across the line of prisoners, then let out a snort. "Come." Myrion glanced nervously at the Huntmaster, but the Qunari tracker had walked back to the ship. Qunari guards came forward, carrying massive chests between them, and dropped them to the sand. As Myrion drew closer, he saw that the chests were filled with wood axes, heavy and clumsy, sharp enough to fell a tree, but too clumsy to be much use in a fight. Each prisoner got one, and as he did, he was released from the long prisoner's chain. The prisoners weren't released fully, though. Before they were freed from the prisoner's chain, they were shackled into pairs. Each pair connected at the ankle by a length of chain no longer than Myrion's forearm. Only a pair of circus performers could run while tied together like that. Before Myrion knew it, He and the prisoner in front of him were at the front of the line. The other prisoner stepped forward, back straight and shoulders square under his brown laborer's tunic. His hair was silver, Myrion noted, and revised the other prisoner's age up a few decades. "Right," said the prisoner, holding out a calloused hand to the guard standing over the chest of axes. "Off to work, then." And as he turned, Myrion saw the points of the man's ears. An elf. That explained everything. Myrion's mouth twisted into a sneer as the Qunari handed the elf the axe. Any elf in Ventus would have been a slave, so of course he'd have no loyalty to the Imperium, no understanding of what Tevinter had protected him from all these years. He'd probably laughed as the soldiers had been cut down, the mages poisoned, happy to trade one master for another. "Filthy knife ear," Myrion muttered, glaring at the elf, unaware that the words had worked themselves free from his mouth until the elf and the Qunari guard stared at him. The elf was the first to recover. "Lazy Shem isn't used to working," he said with an easy smile. "Not with those soft hands of his. Chain me to another elf so I don't embarrass the poor man." "You'd embarrassed me with your knife-eared stupidity," Myrion snapped, "and then stabbed me as soon as my back was turned."
"Quiet!" the guard roared. "There will be no disruptions."
He spoke slowly. Most of the Qunari didn't speak trade well, Myrion remembered. "Then chain me to a man, not this knife ear," Myrion said, glaring at the silver-haired elf. "Probably faster for everyone if you do it," the elf added. "Humans of Ventus are an ugly lot, and they only care for their own." The guard hesitated for a moment, but then a booming voice startled them all.
"No."
They all turned to see the Bastar stomping over from another line of new prisoners. There were prison ships landing all along the beach. He glared at the guard, who shrank back, and then smiled at Myrion and the elf.
"The boss must learn. There are no more elves, no more humans. There are only boss. Must work to prove themselves worthy of serving the Qun."
He turned to the guard.
"Chain them together. Let them learn to work as one." "As you say, Bastar,"
the guard murmured, and brought out a chain. He clapped one cuff around the elf's ankle, snapping it shut, and then turned to Myrion. Helpless, Myrion stepped forward. The cuff was cold on his right leg, pinching his tender skin as it snapped shut. "As you say, Bastard," the elf said with an obedient smile, and the big Qunari looked at him, then nodded and strode off, ready to give orders to another line. Myrion let out a shaky breath as the guard undid the prisoner's chain and slapped a woodcutting axe into his hand. He glared at the elf. "You could have gotten us killed." "What's that, Shem?" the elf asked, his face a mask of innocence. "These old knife ears aren't as sharp as they used to be, and sometimes I hear things wrong."
"Go now and cut the trees,"
the guard said, pointing to the forest. Myrion saw that other paired prisoners were already at the edge of the wall of green, hacking away.
"Work well, and you will eat well."
The elf started off, and Myrion stumbled as the chain jerked against his ankle. The elf looked back. "Come on, Shem," he said with a little grin. "Try to keep up." Myrion and the elf found an awkward rhythm after a few strides, keeping pace so that the two legs chained together moved as one. Myrion's legs were longer than the elf's, and he had to shorten his steps. "You keep running your mouth like that, you'll get killed," Myrion said, as they made their way across the grass, the chain hissing between them. "You're still a slave, idiot! Only now you're a slave to beasts that will kill you as soon as look at you." "What would you know about it?" the elf asked. His voice wasn't friendly anymore, and when Myrion looked over he saw that the elf was looking ahead at the forest. "You're no laborer, whatever tunic you wear." Myrion's breath hitched, and his grip tightened around the axe he carried. "You don't know what you're talking about, elf." "Strife," the elf said. "What?" "There's more than one elf around here. Call me Strife, and I know what I'm talking about better than you, I'd wager." Strife, if that was what he wished to call himself, still wasn't looking at Myrion, squinting instead into the trees ahead of them. The loose tunic hides your belly, but those nice rounded forearms say that you haven't missed many meals. And you keep your head down out of fear, not habit. Myrion jerked his hands back up into his sleeves. At least I keep my head down at all. They came to a stop as the grass thickened into waist-high weeds. On either side of them, other pairs of prisoners had already started chopping at the trees, the dull thumps of their clumsy blows echoing through the air. "Son of slave talks about nuance," Myrion snapped. Strife stepped to the tree closest to them, a blunt, ugly thing whose trunk was so thick that Myrion couldn't have reached his arm around it. "Guards are watching, Shem. Probably want to start chopping." He stepped to the tree and swung his axe with casual strength, his blade biting into the bark. "Myrion, elf. There's more than one Shem around here." He stepped up, looked at the tree a bit uncertainly, hefted his axe, and swung. The blade hit at an angle with a jolt that sent pins and needles up Myrion's arm, and he winced, dropping his axe. As it thudded into the soft turf, Strife burst out laughing. "Now there's a man who's never done a day's hard work in his life. What were you, Myrion, before you put on those laborer's clothes to hide from the Qunari? A merchant? A petty noble? Myrion was moving before he realized, and his fist smacked Strife in the face. The elf stumbled back, his smile gone and his face going red with anger. "Shut your mouth, you damned knife-ear!" The smile was back a moment later, though, and the elf sank his axe into the soft turf and clenched his fists. "Why don't you make me, Shem?" Myrion came in with another swing, but this time the elf stepped into the blow and caught it on his tucked-up arms. It was like punching a thick rope, and Myrion's knuckles stung as he tried to step back, then stumbled as the chain reached its limit and nearly tripped him. A sudden flash blossomed into pain, and Myrion staggered from a blow he hadn't even seen coming until it cracked across his face. In the distance, he heard yells and shouts, but then Strife punched him in the gut, and Myrion sank to his knees as the air whooshed out of him. "Isn't that just like in Tevinter?" Strife asked, standing over him. From the corner of his eye, Myrion saw that the Qunari guard was approaching with Boss Tar himself alongside him. "Starting fights you can't finish. Take away your mages and your slaves and your blood magic and you're all soft." The guard put a hand to his blade, but Boss Tar grabbed his hand. He looked at Myrion and smiled, then shook his head. "Now get up and work," Strife muttered, leaning in. Myrion lunged to his feet, ramming his head up and catching the surprised elf in the gut. As Strife staggered back, Myrion punched him again and again. "No slave would talk like that," he said, breath hitching from effort as he brought his fists together to smash down on Strife's head. "Whoever you are, you're a fraud, and as soon as I tell the guards—" Strife's forearm, lean with long, ropey muscles, slapped Myrion's fists aside, and his other fist hammered Myrion's chest just below the breastbone, stealing his breath. As he stumbled, Strife caught him by the shoulder and leaned in. "And people say I talk too much," he said, and then his other hand came in with a blow Myrion saw coming, but couldn't do anything about. And the world exploded into light, and then darkness. As the world slid away, he heard the Qunari laugh. The Qunari guards had beaten Strife afterward, of course, but it had been a perfunctory beating, to make sure he knew that there'd be more of the same if he talked back or caused more trouble. Later, the guards dragged him and the unconscious Myrion, still chained to him at the ankle, to a makeshift shelter where the prisoners were secured for the night. The guards came around with bowls filled with some sort of savory porridge, and Strife shoveled it into his mouth. Beside him, Myrion, finally awake, sniffed at it and grimaced. "Not up to your fancy tastes?" Strife asked, shaking his head. "Shut up!" Myrion glared at him and then took a bite, chewing more than he needed to with a sour look on his face. "That's the spirit. Eat hearty. You've got a full day's work ahead of you." The shelter was open on one side to let what passed for a breeze flow through and cool down the prisoners. Strife had a good view of the forest in the distance, The greens of the mossy trunks and the heavy leaves darkened to black in the dim gray starlight. As he ate, a pale white form separated itself from the forest. It was a Hala, antlers curling out like Tevinter's sabers. It scented the air, one foreleg raised. When it saw Strife looking at it, the Hala tapped the ground slowly and deliberately 3 times. Strife shook his head and tapped his leg twice. The Hala ducked its head down, then it turned back into the forest. Gone as quickly as it had arrived. What was that? Strife looked over at Myrion, whose eyes were narrowed in thought. What was what? That deer. It was like you talked to it. Don't be silly, Strife said, smiling and cracking his knuckles. It was a deer. I'd shoot it off so it wouldn't end up in the porridge. No, those white ones Myrion thought. A holla. That's what the Dalish elves used to pull their wagons. Is it? Strife downed another spoonful of the porridge. It wasn't bad once you started thinking of it as lukewarm stew after your brothers had already gotten the good parts. You know that's what it was, Myrion glared. Is that what you are? One of those Dalish bandits? Seems to me, Strife murmured, putting his bowl down, if I were chained to one of those Dalish elves, the ones willing to kill any Shem who looks at them wrong, I'd watch my mouth, because that Dalish elf might be here secretly, and he'd have to kill anyone who gave him away. Myrion opened his mouth, and then looked up guiltily as the guard stopped in front of them. Bowl, said the guard, a thick Qunari warrior who seemed to be made of scar tissue and knee skin. Now. Myrion looked at Strife. Strife raised an eyebrow, curling one hand into a fist where Myrion couldn't see. Myrion passed the bowl to the guard. Thank you for supper. Strife did the same, head down to hide his grin. When the guard had moved to the next chained pair, he looked at Myrion. Thank you for supper? That's how the slaves talked in your manner. I didn't. Myrion caught himself, then glowered. Threaten me again and you'll find my tone quite different. Don't worry. Strife lay back on his pallet, using his arm as a makeshift pillow. Tomorrow I'll be away from here, and you'll be chained to someone new. Is that so? Myrion asked. Strife wasn't sure whether the man sounded angry or curious. Maybe both. You'll see. He shut his eyes and went to sleep with the ease of long practice, sleeping in uncomfortable places. The Qunari came early in the morning to wake them all, and Strife pulled himself up, as did Myrion, who was groaning and whining exactly like a good slave wouldn't. Whatever he'd been before the Qunari conquered Ventus, it hadn't involved getting up early. I must speak to Boss Ta, Strife said, when the guard started to unchain them from the main chain line. There is other work I should be doing. The guard, a burly Qunari whose face looked like something a Tevinter noble saved for his dogs at the end of the day, stared down at Strife. You cut the trees. His hand moved slowly to the cudgel at his waist. Strife nodded. Yes, but Boss Ta will want me to do something else when I speak with him. Myrion was shifting nervously beside him. The little man would already be trotting off with an axe he didn't know how to use, ready to make some new blisters. So would Strife if he'd been 30 years younger, looking up at a human guard. Hurry along so the guards didn't notice you, and maybe you'd get through the day without trouble. Via Bordasan, Strife thought, keeping his eyes on the guard. It was one of the first things the Dalish had taught him. The way of the bow, as the sapling bends, so must you. In yielding you find resilience. In pliancy, find strength. The guard finally looked away. Come, he muttered, and walked off. Strife moved to keep up, and Myrion, with a muttered oath, also hurried to keep pace. What are you doing? The human muttered as they walked across the beach toward the Qunari command tent. Don't worry. In a few minutes it won't be your problem. Boss Tar looked up from the papers as the guard came in. When he saw Strife and Myrion, the smile he gave made Strife think of cracking knuckles.
"What do the boss need?"
Strife bowed. "I am trained in alchemy. I worked with another elf. He called himself Thontiel." Boss Tar snorted, the gold paint on his face wrinkling, but he seemed interested despite himself.
"We do not know the names of the boss."
"He has marks upon his face." Strife touched his cheeks. "Like branches. He's also trained in alchemy. Together we could help with more than cutting down trees."
"Ah,"
Boss Tar smiled, slow and easy.
"I know this boss. He also talked too much."
"Bend, but never break," Strife remembered. "Put me with him then," he said, "and I will see to it that he is quiet." Boss Tar looked at the guard and said something in the Qunari language. He turned to Strife.
"You will go to the other elf now. You will work as he does."
His smile curved like a sword built for chopping.
"The Qun is generous in fulfilling such requests."
Strife ducked his head. "My thanks, Boss Todd." Myrion's elbow dug into his side, but Myrion was a whiny little man who wouldn't be Strife's problem for much longer. The guard led them across the beach toward another large tent. Strife walked easily, watching as the other prisoners set to work with axes. The dull thumps of axes cutting into wood were little drumbeat under the constant foamy song of the ocean waves crashing against the shore. "I don't like this," Myrion muttered beside him. "The Qunari don't change their minds like that. I took classes in this. They think everyone is born to do a certain job, and they don't just let you change your mind because you complain about it." "Wishing you'd let them know you were a scribe and not a laborer?" Strife asked. "Listen, you knife-eared idiot. You're causing trouble. I don't want to get caught in it, too." "In a few minutes we'll be chained to different people and you'll never have to worry about me again," Strife said. In a few minutes he'd be with Thontiel, who'd signaled that he'd gotten his hands on the Qunari plans right after Ventus had fallen. Then he and Thontiel would be off into the woods, waiting for a certain Hala to show up and guide them to safety. And a few hours after that, he'd be singing old elven songs around a campfire, with Thontiel warbling on the high notes and Irelin telling him that his accent was still terrible after all these years. They would laugh about the Qunari, and about idiot Tevinter men who'd never learned to stand up for themselves with blood magic and slaves to support them. Strife would turn the shackles into a lovely decoration on his quiver. The guard opened the flap to the tent, and Strife and Myrion stepped inside, their chain clinking between them. The smell hit Strife first, hot lye and sweaty steam, and as his eyes adjusted, he realized that it was the stink of laundry. Robed figures were dumping dirty clothes into vats and stirring the clothes around. Not the alchemists, then, Strife realized. Their robes were different from the prisoners' uniforms he'd gotten, and they didn't match each other either. Some robes were slim, while others hid the figures inside them behind voluminous folds. If they hadn't been mindlessly beating the clothes, Strife would have thought the prisoners were chantry priests. "Where's Thontiel?" Strife asked the guard, stepping into the room. Enclosed like this, it would have been even easier for the two of them to escape once the guard left. Strife looked around, squinting against the acrid steam, and saw a tall, slim figure who wasn't wearing robes. "Thant! That you?" Thontiel didn't answer, and Strife went to him, Myrion trotting behind with awkward, jittery steps. "Wait," the human was saying. "Wait, this isn't right." Strife caught Thontiel's shoulder and turned him around. The eyes, the bright blue eyes of an elf who had never known the pain and indignity of living in an alien age, met Strife's stare. They were dull and glassy, and devoid of recognition. Thontiel's mouth hung open, and he swayed in Strife's grasp, a vacant weight. The Valisleen tattooed across his face, a mark of adulthood for those raised in the Dalish clan, were the only remnant of Strife's friend. "The robes!" Myrion hissed. "These were mages!" Strife turned and saw another worker, who was dragging a wooden hamper across the sand. Her eyes were flat and empty, just like Thanthiel's, but her robe, filthy and sodden as it was, still glittered at the hem with remnants of gold trim. What did the Qunari do to the mages they took prisoner? Strife tried to remember, and then cursed himself for a fool as a blow cracked across his back and brought him to his knees.
"This boss also spoke too much,"
said the guard with a grisly smile, now standing before Strife. He held up a bottle filled with viscous brown liquid.
"Now he is quiet. You work with him, you will be quiet too."
A meaty hand clapped down on Strife's shoulder. Myrion tried to pull away, and the guard backhanded him, sending the man to the ground with a bloody nose. "Thant! Help me!" Strife tried to stand, and the guard delivered a blow that set the world spinning and rattled Strife's teeth. A few feet away, Thanthiel stood impassively, watching without interest as the guard pried Strife's mouth open. The Qunari gave mages something. Some kind of poison that left them like walking corpses. He tried to knock the bottle away, but the guard's grip was like a vice. Another blow rocked Strife's head, and he gasped despite himself, and then the bottle pressed against his lips. The bitter liquid flooded his mouth. A thunderclap shook the room, and Strife collapsed as the guard let go. He spat the liquid to the floor, coughing and shaking his head, and then looked up. The guard lay on the ground, smoke wafting from a hole in his chest. Beside Strife, Myrion stood with one hand pointed at the guard. Little tendrils of lightning curled around his shaking fingers. Myrion looked down at him. "Do you know how hard I tried to hide?" Strife opened his mouth. "This is your fault!" Myrion snarled, and Strife felt hands close around his throat. The stupid knife ear had nearly gotten Myrion killed. The elf wasn't dead yet, but as good as. Myrion's fingers dug into the older man's throat, and his vision pounded red. Blood from his nose dripped down his shirt and onto the sandy ground. The knife ear was saying something, trying to anyway, hands clutching at Myrion's wrists. "Can you break the shackles?" the elf gasped, and Myrion's fingers clenched even harder in his anger. "If I could break the shackles, do you think I'd still be here?" "Then," the elf's voice was a ragged gasp, "I hope you're ready to drag my body as you escape." Myrion froze. A moment later, he snatched his hands back, and Strife hunched over, coughing. "What do you mean, escape?" he asked. Strife coughed a bit more, then smiled up at Myrion, his face still red. "How would you like to see the sights of Arlethan Forest?" Everyone knew Arlethan Forest was haunted, racked by old elven magic that lingered centuries later. A monument to the elves' lack of discipline an old magister had once told Myrion. Myrion had thought it sounded sad. But today, it might mean freedom. Myrion narrowed his eyes, wiping the blood from his face. His nose had finally stopped bleeding. "You can get us away from the Qunari." Strife's grin showed some teeth. "I can give you a better chance than you've got standing here." He stood and stepped toward the other elf, who still stood vacant-eyed and impassive before them. Myrion followed as Strife grabbed the elf's shoulder. Thant, it's me!" He slapped the elf's cheek. "Come on!" "It's no use." Myrion saw the naked pain in Strife's face and looked away. "The Qunari drug. It's called Kamek. The Magisterium warned us about it. With as much as they'd given them, I don't think they're ever coming back." There'd been a pamphlet about it. He'd read it over lunch before an afternoon playing wisp darts with friends. Jessica had said a nice empty mind sounded like a welcome relief after dealing with warding rituals all summer. Her sun-kissed skin had gleamed, her robes trimmed to leave her arms bare except for twining serpent bracelets that glittered in the light. One of the laundry workers wore robes that left the arms bare. Her back was to him, but Myrion saw little white lines against tan skin where bracelets would have sat on her arms. He refused to look at her face. If you've got a plan, we need to go now. Something in his voice got through to the elf, and Strife looked over, nodded, and then pulled the other elf close. Same clothes. Maybe... He pulled the elf's tunic open, pawed through it. What are you doing? Myrion demanded. Do you want to end up a mindless husk? Ventiel snuck into your city to get information about the Qunari invasion. He said he'd gotten a hold of their plan. Strife pulled his hand back with a small folded square of paper. Right, Thant. I'll carry it for you. He sighed, then reached up with both hands and cupped his friend's head and chin. No cure, you said. No coming back. Not when they're like this. I'm sorry. Then I can at least give him peace, Strife sighed, and then twisted sharply. Myrion heard a crack. Andrew will guide your way, Thant, he murmured, as he lowered his friend's body to the ground. Then he stood and turned to Myrion, his face grim. If you want to live, Magister, you'll do as I do. If not for me, you'd be helping with the laundry right now, Myrion snapped. Strife knelt by the guard. No key. He pulled out the guard's axe, then let it drop with a wince and grabbed the cudgel instead. That would have been too much to ask for. He stood. Right. Back of the tent. They shuffled over, heading toward the tent. Just minutes ago they had found a kind of rhythm. Now the chain jerked and danced between them, hitching their steps. Strife pulled up the tent flap, waving impatiently. Under. Myrion ducked down and stepped under, out onto the sandy beach. Strife followed, blinking at the cool, clear air. On one side, Myrion saw the ocean, waves frothing with a promise of sucking undertow. On the other, the impenetrable foliage of Arlethan Forest, with prisoners chopping ineffectually at its edges. What now? Myrion asked. Now we get to the forest, Strife said, and meet my clan. He started walking. Myrion fell in beside him, matching the elf's stride on a path behind the rows of working tents, running parallel to the shore. So you are Dalish. Guess we were both hiding something, Magister, Strife said with a bitter chuckle. Why don't you have the tattoos? Myrion asked. Like your friend back in the tent. Strife paused and looked back at the tent with a glare that promised violence. Thant was a good man. He deserved better than the Qunari gave him. So had Jessica, Myrion mused, thinking of the figure back in the tent whose face he hadn't looked at. No one deserved to be prisoners in their own mind, shackled by Qunari drugs just like the mages rendered tranquil in the south, denied even a quick death. It was an awful effort, without a staff pulling the little wisps of magic into order. He mouthed an old meditation chant that he'd learned at university, guiding the magic with his will, until it was ready, scratching at the edge of the barrier between the mortal world and the world of spirits. And then, sweating, he opened the path and let the energy through. A ball of fire rolled wetly across the top of the tent, sooty flame curling out as the leather caught. The cries of alarm were immediate from the Qunari command tents. If anyone inside the laundry tent cried out, Myrion didn't hear it. What in Andruel's name did you do? Strife shouted. Myrion met his look. I gave everyone in that tent a merciful end, like you did for your friend. You idiot! Strife grabbed him by the front of the tunic. They might not have noticed we were gone for an hour. Now they'll be on our heels! Myrion shoved Strife away. You're saying we should have just left them like that. I'm saying you shouldn't have started a big fire, Strife growled. Come on! He turned and started to run. Myrion tried to follow, and then, tangled in the chain he'd forgotten was there, he tripped and fell to the sand. His hands and forearms stung from the impact. The salty air nipped at his eyes. Using magic always left him feeling sensitive, as though everything were just a bit sharper. On your feet, Magister! Strife pulled on his shoulder, and Myrion let himself be dragged up. Not a magister, you damned knife-ear, he muttered, and they were running. Inside foot, outside. Inside, outside, Strife muttered beside him. Find the rhythm if you want to make it to the trees. Myrion tried to find the rhythm, his blood pounding in his ears louder than the surf as they ran. The sand pulled at his sandals, and around him shouts of alarm came from both the Qunari and the prisoners. Myrion kept running, looking at his feet next to Strife's. The sand turned to scrubby grass beneath his sandals, and Myrion heard a shout from his right, past Strife. He looked up to see one of the guards turning toward them, a thick-bodied Qunari, short for their race, whose horns had been replaced with little dragon's head caps. Strife caught the guard in the face with the stolen cudgel, kicked him in the knee, and then smashed the cudgel across the back of his head. He might have done more, but Myrion had still been running, and a moment later the chain snapped taut between them, with a painful wrench that sent Myrion face first to the turf again. Idiot mage, Strife hissed. He'd ended up on his back, and rolled now to his feet, yanking the chain back with another tug on Miriam's leg. You didn't say you was stopping! Myrion got to his hands and knees, then pushed himself up, yanking on the chain as well. I didn't think I had to! Inside foot, go! Strife jerked into a run, and Myrion clumsily matched his stride. The chain between them hissed through the grass, jerking when it hit twigs. Then, the forest was before them. Dark, angry trees looming overhead, as if daring Myrion to approach. He stumbled, and Strife grabbed his shoulder and pulled him into the forest proper. The darkness was sudden and blinding after the morning light on the beach. The air reeked of dead leaves and old dirt, and branches slashed at Myrion's face and arms as he followed alongside the elf. His lungs burned. They both jerked as the chain snagged on a root. Myrion staggered into a tree to catch himself, then slid down the mossy trunk to his knees. Strife snarled and turned back, tugging at the chain. Myrion looked up at a flash of movement before him. The snowy white deer was there, sliding out from between two trunks ahead of them. No, not a deer. A Halla was what the Dalish called them. The Halla looked at Myrion, his breath heaving and his leg throbbing from the shackle, and then at Strife. Then, with a shimmering sparkle of magic, the Halla slid into the form of a young elven woman. She was thin, and her features were more striking than pretty, her hair cut short and freckles on her face blurring into the Dalish tattoo across her forehead. She wore supple leather, trimmed with fur, and she held a bow in one hand along with a quiver of arrows. I brought you a bow, she said to Strife. You brought me a magister. Yes, your gift is better. You win. Strife tugged on the chain. Where's that? She waved a hand, and the roots slid back into the soil, leaving the chain free. The Antam used the mind poison on him, Strife sighed, and, after a glance at Myrion, added, all we could do was give him a merciful end. The Antam will pay. The woman's voice was quiet, but Myrion felt the air shudder at her anger. I'm not a magister, he said. I am a mage, though. My name is Myrion. No key? She asked. Myrion blinked, then realized she was looking at the shackles. None, Strife said. I don't suppose your magic can get us loose? The elven woman squinted. The tattoo on her face made her look like she was glaring. Or maybe she was glaring. No. You could cut the Magister's foot off, then you'd only have the chain to worry about. I'm not a Magister, you stupid knife! Myrion broke off as Strife cuffed him on the back of the head. Play nice, Irelin, Strife said to the elf, smiling. He keeps the foot for now. I can hide your trail, the woman, apparently Irelin, said. No, you need to go. Strife pulled out the paper he'd gotten from his friend's tunic and passed it to Irelin. The Qunari are moving into Ravane. You need to get word to the clans before they land. Irelin looked at Myrion with her maybe glare, then back to Strife. I can be there and back by midnight. Can you stay ahead of the Qunari until then? In this forest? With a smile, Strife patted the nearest tree trunk. I've no doubt Myrion and I will lose them. Direth Sherrod, lass. Bring back a lockpick if you've a mind to. Direth Sherrod. Irelin turned to glare at Myrion. I liked Thant. I like Strife too. If the Qunari get him because of you, you lose more than a foot. For a moment, Irelin reminded him of the old mage who had trained him in combat magic back in university. None of his barriers had been good enough, and his firebolts had been perfunctory. Her face was scarred from fighting with the Qunari, making her scowl even worse when she ordered Myrion to stay late for more practice. He had hated her with a burning passion, until the day he saw her sitting by the fountain. She was crying, holding a letter whose wax seal marked it as coming from the front lines of the war. He had not liked her after that exactly, but he had stopped complaining about staying late for more practice. Myrion pushed himself back to his feet. His legs were shaky and his breath was only now coming back. But he met the elf-woman's glare. If the Qunari get him, it means that I'm already dead. So your threats are empty. Are you going to get moving? Or are you going to stay here and waste your time glaring at the Shem? She wasted another moment glaring at the Shem, and then the air around her shimmered with magic. A moment later, a falcon hung in the air where she had stood, and with a quick beat of its wings, it was darting through the forest and up through the branches and away. That went well, Strife said after a moment. He looked back, and Myrion heard shouting behind them. Ready to run? Now, inside foot, outside. Inside, outside. The Antom had sent the Huntmaster to Bastar just days ago, after the fall of Ventus. Bastar did not think he needed a Huntmaster. He even worked the boss like the clumsy, lazy animals they were, so that even those who did try to flee were too weak to make it far. The Huntmaster had offered no further explanation with the written order, and the Bastar had assumed it was another small sign of disorganization in the invasion. Usually the other Qunari were there to support the Antom, the workers crafting the gear and managing supplies, the Tamasran priests making sure the Antom were healthy in mind as in body, the Ben Hasrath spies scouting behind enemy lines and removing any Antom who might forsake their training and abandon the Qun. This time, the Antom had attacked the boss of the south without the blessing of the other Qunari, and little things were not working as well as they should. Supplies were late. Ships were not in good repair. As he walked out onto the beach where the Huntmaster stood, Bastar growled to himself at the treachery of the other Qunari. Had they been here to support the Antom in bringing death to the boss of the south, the two prisoners would not have escaped. Bastar would find a prisoner to beat later. The Huntmaster carried a bow that stood as tall as a human, as well as a wicked spear longer than the Huntmaster himself. He had an arrow knocked in the bow now. Bastar did not see at first what the Huntmaster was aiming at, and then, squinting down the beach, he saw a black gull pecking at a dead crab. The Huntmaster held his greatbow at full draw as Bastar approached. While Bastar ordinarily thought little of scouts and hunters, he had to admit that holding such a bow drawn for so long was an impressive feat. Still,
Will you kill it? Will you kill it?
He asked, in the proper language of the Qun as he came up behind the other Qunari. For a moment, the Huntmaster did not respond. Then, without turning, he said,
It's no threat. The path of the Qun does not call for needless violence. Your arrow is already knocked,
Bastar pointed out. The path of the Qun does not call for wasted effort. Why draw back your bow, if not to use it? For a long moment, the Huntmaster looked at the black gull in the distance.
I wish to know whether I could strike a target from such a distance.
Slowly, with perfect control of his movements, he relaxed the bow and returned the arrow to its quiver. Bastar glowered at the Huntmaster. This is why he thought less of Antom, who did not fight on the front lines. Even the black and white striped vitar that painted the Huntmaster's face was drawn to symbolize sight, finding, rather than battle and power as befitted the Antam.
And now?
The Huntmaster smiled faintly.
Now, I know. You know nothing, Bastar snapped. You did not kill the girl. To not know something is foolishness, the Huntmaster said. To know by doing is experience. To know without needing to do is wisdom.
It was one of the sayings of the Qun, one of the talky lessons Bastar had never cared for. The parts about obeying orders and non-followers of the Qun getting ground into the dust had always been his favorites.
This wastes our time, and you are needed,
he said to the Huntmaster, stifling a growl.
2 prisoners escaped. 1 may be a mage. I thought you killed all the mages in Ventus, the Huntmaster said. Even those who surrendered and did not fight.
The words held an edge.
Without the Ben Hasrath to interrogate the mages and discern which ones could be trusted, we had no choice but to administer Kamek to all of them.
Bastar smiled. That at least was a benefit of the Antam acting alone. No Ben Hasrath to say,
no, this mage should not live. Do not hurt them more than necessary. This one hid his nature and acted as a normal boss. How much Kamek did you give the mages?
The Huntmaster's voice was calm now, a mountain lake on a windless day.
We have no Ben Hasrath to measure it for us, Bastar said with a hard smile. So we gave them a heavy dose, to be sure. None of the Sarbas or the other troublesome prisoners will ever come back to their minds.
Another benefit of no Ben Hasrath. They always preferred halfway measures, shackling a man's mind when it was so much easier to simply break it.
I had heard of your work in Ventus, and now I see that it is true.
The Huntmaster nodded to Bastar in respect, one of the followers of the Qun who knew the truth of another.
I will follow the fleeing prisoners. Your 12 most devoted warriors will come with me. My 12 most devoted warriors, and me, Bastar corrected, and smiled broadly. The boss will learn what it means to disobey me. It shall be done as you order, the Huntmaster said with a small nod.
And though the Huntmaster might have been weak by the standards of the Antam, a hunter and tracker rather than a real warrior, Bastar saw that the other Qunari had a little smile on his face as well. Behind him, far in the distance, the gull shrieked once, and then flew away. Strife moved through the forest, his steps quick and assured. Beside him, or more often behind him, the idiot Magister huffed and thrashed and stepped on every damned dry leaf the forest saw fit to put before them. There were other noises, too, sibilant whispers that curled through the branches overhead, tiny crackling breaths of something huge just out of view. Arlethan was like that. Strife had once called it haunted. Irelin had said that the spirits remembered what once had been. Up ahead, something moved on a tree branch, silhouetted against the sunlight so that he couldn't see it, only the suggestion of a shape. Strife pulled an arrow from his quiver and raised his bow without slowing his stride. Whatever it was slid back into the shadows. "Trouble?" Myrion gasped behind him. Strife slid his arrow back into the quiver.
"Don't let it worry you."
"Concern for my feelings, Nifia. Concern for the spirits of the forest that can feel our moods," Strife snapped. "I know I belong here, so they leave me alone. With all your fear, you might as well be leaving a trail of fresh blood to bring something dangerous our way. So don't let it worry you, Magister." Myrion huffed. "I've been guarding my thoughts from demons since I was 14 years old. Took a test on it and everything. A desire demon took the form of a boy I liked. The spirits of Arlethan are more powerful than your little wisps your teachers summoned to test you. I just hope you're better with spirits than you are with the forest." "I'm better with anything than I am with the forest." Myrion glared at the bushes. "I managed to get lost in the gardens of Minrathis once, fell into an ornamental pond.
I couldn't have ended up chained to a magister who likes hiking.
Strife let it go. The man was a mage. If he said he could deal with the demons, Strife had to trust that at least. They kept going. Besides Strife, slow but steady, the mage kept moving, muttering something under his breath in a low chant. Strife thought it was magic, until he caught the words in time with their each step. Inside, outside, inside, outside. When the shafts of sunlight snaking down through the gaps in the leafy ceiling told him it was mid-afternoon, Strife raised a hand and stopped. Myrion staggered forward a few more steps, yanking against the shackle on Strife's left leg, and then he got the message and sagged against a tree, gasping for air like he'd been the one half-strangled a few hours ago. "Have they given up?" the mage asked, panting.
"I can't very well tell with you wheezing over there, can I?"
Strife snapped.
"I take it you let your slaves do most of the running?"
Myrion made a rude gesture and closed his eyes. After a moment, his breathing slowed. Strife shut his eyes as well, and listened. The leaves shifted in the wind. Off in the distance, something chased its prey on too many legs. A bird pecked at the bark of a nearby tree, hunting for bugs. And behind that, the clank of metal.
"Killing ain't guide my steps,"
Strife murmured, and then looked down to Myrion.
"Breaks over, Magister. Time to climb."
"Climb?" The mage looked at him blankly.
"The Qunari are behind us."
Strife strode to a large tree, with low-hanging branches, pausing so that Myrion could catch up.
"I need a better vantage point to know whether they're stumbling around blind, or on our trail."
"So?" He grabbed a branch and pulled, catching the rigid bark beneath the slippery moss, with an expertise of long practice, and bringing himself up into the branch with a smooth movement.
"Climb."
The mage followed, ungainly and awkwardly. Strife took it slow, and still had to descend a bit and lower his own leg a few times so that the mage could keep up. It took them several minutes to reach the upper branches, a climb Strife could normally have made in seconds. The mage's clothing was torn and littered with twigs by the time he made it. It was worth it for the view, though. Here in the highest branches, Strife could see the trees below, and off in the distance, not far enough, still, the forest's edge in the misty clouds that marked the ocean. And before that, glinting through the branches, the shine of metal in the trees. It was a straight damned line between him and the edge of the forest. Blast! Strife eased back down and Myrion followed, his fingers scrambling at the moss.
"They've got a tracker. Their huntmaster must be worth his name."
"You told Irelin you could lose them," the mage said with an accusatory note. He slipped a little, and dropped hard onto the branch. The chain pulled taut between them, and Strife grunted and dropped down as well.
"Well, I didn't know their huntmaster was any good,
now, did I?" he muttered back. He slid nimbly down to the next branch, and then dropped to the ground. This time the chain yanked on Myrion's leg, and he fell from his branch and landed hard in the mud. Idiot. The mage's heart didn't seem to be in it, though. What now?
"Vira-san," Strife said. "The way of the arrow. Be swift and silent. Strike true and do not waver. It's a hunter's saying, but in this case, we are the prey. There's a river a few hours away. We'll lose the huntmaster there."
Myrion pushed himself back to his feet. "Ready when you are, knife-ear." Strife started up again. Inside, outside, inside, outside. He heard the mage still muttering it under his breath with each step. He was slow, but he didn't give up. The chain danced between them, jingling with every step. "What's that saying from?" he gasped a while later. "The bit with the arrow."
"Via Tanadal."
A wall of heavy foliage blocked the path ahead, and Strife gestured for them to head left.
"The way of the three trees. Wisdom passed down from the goddess Andruil."
"Right, the elven gods," Myrion smirked. "A lot of good they did you." Strife shot him a glare,
If we get out of here alive, it'll be because of what Andruil taught my people.
Myrion opened his mouth to fire something back, and Strife shouldered the mage into a tree. The man smeared the moss as he staggered against it, which would make tracking them easier. But the Huntmaster had already tracked them easily enough.
Be careful how you speak of the Lady of the Hunt while you stand in her forest.
Myrion glared and shoved him back. Fine. That must be why the Elven Empire is the greatest in the world today. Strife's hands clenched into fists. Myrion raised a hand and his fingers crackled with lightning. Oh, wait. Tevinter overthrew the elves, established the largest empire in the known world, and held off the savage Qunari for centuries because we know how to wield power instead of letting it run wild in a damned haunted forest. Strife laughed.
You did it on the backs of slaves, Shem. Elven slaves.
He wanted to punch the glare off the mage's face, but he leaned in instead.
And the Qunari are stomping all over your great empire as we speak.
He stepped back, then turned and started walking, yanking on the chain.
Come on. Break's over.
They moved in silence after that. It was nearing sundown by the time they reached the river. It was about 50 paces across, dark water foaming white around the rocks, and shallow enough that they could walk instead of swimming if they were smart about it.
Come on.
He pointed at a bit of frothing white.
We'll use the rocks under there.
Myrion pointed at a chain of rocks a bit upstream. Why not there?
Because the Huntmaster's behind us.
Strife started moving and the mage came along, rather than trip both of them up.
Walk on the dry rocks, and he'll spot the muddy prints from your sandals. Walk in the water, and it'll be easy to erase any marks we leave.
The river water wasn't too cold, a small blessing, and Strife picked his way across, moving from stone to stone, and keeping them in the shallows as much as possible. When he was halfway across, he changed direction, moving them upstream. Why the change? The mage asked, raising his voice a little over the crash of the water.
They'll be expecting us to cross directly, Strife answered, or go downstream since it's easier.
He looked up at the afternoon sky.
Even if this doesn't lose the Huntmaster, it will buy us some time.
That makes sense. The mage said it warily, like a peace offering. Strife paused as the chain snagged on a rock. He tugged it free and made his way farther upstream, the mage behind him. When he thought they'd gone far enough, he went a little farther, because moving upstream always felt farther than it actually was. And then he looked for a likely spot.
When we come out of the river, he said, we need to leave as little trace as possible. Muddy footprints, broken branches, all of that tells them right where to start looking for us again.
How do we get out without leaving marks? The mage asked. Strife squinted.
There.
He pointed at a large rock at the edge of the river.
We climb onto that, then hop onto that little one next to it, and from there onto the fallen log.
The log didn't even have any moss on it. What about our muddy footprints?
Strife smiled. I imagine the river's done a better job washing your sandals than the slaves you're used to. We'll leave water, but it should dry off quickly enough in the afternoon sun.
Myrion glared, then looked at where Strife had pointed. There's sand and mud all around those rocks. One slip, and we'll leave prints even a blind man can track.
Then I'd suggest you don't slip,
Strife said, and started for the shore. They reached the large rock, which was orange and flat, and hung out over the river like a balcony. Strife hopped up easily enough, at least most of the way, and then fell onto his stomach when the chain went taut. A moment later, Myrion climbed up, huffing.
Right.
Strife got to his feet and offered the mage a hand.
We move together, Magister.
Myrion took his hand and Strife pulled him up to his feet. He pointed down at the next rock, a wide speckled one that would be large enough for just the two of them to stand on together.
Ready?
Myrion grunted and they jumped. Strife made it easily enough, and then Myrion landed and bumped into him. And he pinwheeled his arms, standing on one leg on the very edge of the rock and looking down at the wet sand just waiting for him to land and make an enormous mess. The mage's arm clamped down on his shoulder and hauled him back. Clumsy oaf.
I'm the clumsy oaf.
Strife resisted the urge to punch the mage. Instead, he pointed at the fallen log and the wall of the dark forest ahead of them, tantalizingly close.
On 3. We jump for that. Try not to wave your arms around this time, Magister. 1.
I'm not a Magister, Myrion muttered.
2.
Just before Strife would have said 3, an arrow punched into his back. As the elf cried out and fell, Myrion turned, trying not to gloat about not being the clumsy one tripping all over everything in the damned forest for a change. Then he saw the arrow sticking out of the elf's back, and also his front, blood already pooling below his ribs on his left side. And then the elf landed in the mud and rolled, and the chain went taut and yanked Myrion off of his feet. He landed on the rock with a jarring impact, and looking up at the sky saw an arrow flash through where he had just been standing. Groaning, he sat up. The Qunari had reached the river, 100 paces downstream. There were at least a dozen. The huntmaster was the one holding the bow, standing tall and already knocking another arrow. Even at this distance, Myrion recognized his black and white painted face. Beside him, the Bastar's gold-painted face lit up in a savage smile, and he raised a massive axe whose double-bladed head was bigger than a dinner plate and twisted with cruel barbs.
"Boss!" he shouted. "You run fast, but the Qun leads us to you. The Bastar does not lose those in his care."
An arrow glanced off of his rope-knotted armor, and he roared in surprise. Myrion looked over at Strife. The elf was already up, the bow Irelin had give him still thrumming.
"Care for that, Bastar!"
Strife yelled, his voice steady despite the arrow sticking out of his gut, and then ducked down as the huntmaster's next arrow buzzed past his head. "Get behind the log!" Myrion hissed, pulling the magic to him. The magic of the woods was slick and dangerous, heavy one moment and leaping the next. Myrion cast spells in places where the veil was thinner before, letting the magic come to him with little resistance. But this was different. Something else lurked at the edge of his awareness. He ignored it for now, focusing the magic. While the huntmaster and the Bastar held back, the other Qunari were coming up the river, thick swords and large shields held up over their heads. Myrion released his magic, and a bolt of lightning sizzled from his hands. It wreathed one of the Qunari in crackling tendrils of lightning, and then darted across the water to his comrades, jolting them all into a dance of pain. "For Jessica," he murmured, letting the anger focus his mind. Then Strife slammed into him, knocking him down just as the huntmaster's next arrow hissed past them.
"You mentioned the log,"
Strife said, his voice tight with pain. Myrion scrambled to his feet. Inside, outside. Together they scrambled over the log and then hunkered down behind it. "How's your back?"
"It won't be what kills me. Break off the arrow anywhere above the fletching, would you?"
Myrion grabbed the arrow, trying to ignore his revulsion at the sight of it sticking out of the elf's back, and snapped it. "Done? Now what?"
"Hang on."
Strife took a breath, then reached down into his gut, where the arrowhead protruded. With a quick motion, he pulled it through and out, and then released a ragged breath.
"Andrew's tits!"
Myrion was very nearly sick. But if Strife could keep steady after doing that, he could keep steady after watching it. "Should we run?" Strife threw the broken arrow aside, knocked one of his own and drew back his bow and fired. One of the Qunari in the river fell, clutching at his throat, and Strife gave a grunt of satisfaction.
"I had 20 arrows. I'd rather not die with any left in my quiver."
Myrion nodded and pulled the magic to him again. It was still easy, but the sense of something else was stronger this time. Something lurking at the edge of the veil, sensing him pulling at the threads of magic. Again he ignored it, and this time his bolt of lightning sent 2 of the Qunari soldiers in the river down into the water, their limbs spasming. Wisp darts and iced wine, the little pastries they served at the cafe on the hill overlooking the docks, the ones with honey and nuts baked into them. All of that had died with Ventus, And the Qunari would pay. An arrow sank into the log, a handbreadth from his face, and he stared across the river and saw the Huntmaster look directly into his eyes. The Qunari's eyes were cold behind the black and white stripes, showing a calculating intelligence as he drew another arrow.
"You are weak, boss!"
Bastar shouted. He was running along the riverbank, waving his axe and smiling his horrible meat-chopping smile.
"The Qun will teach you obedience."
Strife loosed another arrow. This one snagged the rope-knot armor and pinned Bastar to a tree.
"I've had 50 years to learn obedience, bastard," he called back,
his voice a little ragged now.
"And stronger men than you have tried."
Then he grunted in pain as the Huntmaster sent another arrow clear through the log and into his arm. Myrion raised his hands. If the veil was thin, it was time to see how much he could really do. He pulled across the veil, drawing as much power as he could. And the forest roared in anger. Myrion's spell fizzled into nothingness as a massive form of wood and stone crashed out of the forest. It was as tall as a golem, and it walked on 4 wooden legs bound to stone feet covered in runes and moss. Its body was stone, covered in vines, and 2 great wooden arms rose up, each ending in a blade of thick metal whose edges glowed with lyrium. Tumot's breath, Myrion swore as the thing crashed toward him. He readied another spell, but Strife's hand slapped his shoulder. "No magic! It's a forest guardian!" The elf pulled him back, and they both gave ground, stumbling. The chain snagged on a root, and Myrion fell, landing on his back. Beside him, Strife swayed where he stood, but his hands were steady as he held them up before the thing. "Andarin Atashan! Andarin Atashan! Damn it! This is supposed to work!" Another arrow sank into the tree beside Myrion, and he glared at the Huntmaster downstream. Then back at the forest guardian. "I can't fight without my magic!" The Qunari warriors were closing in now. Before long, they'd have Myrion and Strife cut off from any retreat. "We shouldn't have to fight it at all! Andarin Atashan!" Myrion looked at the Huntmaster, who had another arrow knocked already. "Perhaps we don't have to." He yanked the chain free, grabbed Strife, and pulled him to the left, putting the massive forest guardian between them and the Huntmaster. "Inside, outside, inside, come on, damn it!" Past the guardian, he saw the stripes painted around the Huntmaster's eyes twist as the Qunari glared and lowered his bow. "Listen, you stupid pile of rocks! I'm not here to fight!" Strife shouted at the guardian, scrambling back to his feet. The guardian raised a giant blade arm, and then paused as one of the Qunari warriors struck it from behind. The guardian's reaction was immediate. It stopped, rotated, and turned to the Qunari warrior, whose blade was still raised. It was a big, thick blade, large enough to chop a Bronto in half with a single blow. Unfortunately for the Qunari, the guardian was larger than a Bronto. The forest guardian's arm blade slammed down and chopped the soldier in half. "But kill each other," Myrion muttered, and turned to Strife. He was pale, his eyes glassy. "Come on, Knife-ear. You're going to give up before I do?" Strife's eyes focused and he glared. "Not likely, Magister." Inside foot, outside. Inside. They ran. Once they could no longer hear the fighting, Strife collapsed so that Myrion could get the arrow out of his arm. "You sure I should take it out?" the mage asked. "I can't shoot with it in, that's for certain," Strife grunted. "Through or log? Andrew, that's a strong bow. Oh, what I could do with a bow like that!" The wounds were clean. Seemed clean anyway, but he'd lost a lot of blood. "Do you know any healing magic?" he asked, rolling onto his stomach. "A little. I was better with lightning." Myrion pulled the arrow from Strife's arm, and Strife grunted, refusing to let out anything more. He hoped the darkness hid the pain of his face. "I had a friend, Jessica. She worked with spirits, Once she reattached a man's hand after it had been chopped off.
She sounds like a powerful mage.
Not powerful enough, Myrion sighed in the darkness. I saw her back in the tent. Strife thought about that for a moment.
Then you gave both her and Thant some peace.
She taught me a few tricks, Myrion said, voice quick and businesslike. Maybe I can close your wounds at least. Is it safe to use magic now?
The forest guardians are rare. I'd be surprised if there were another within a day's walk.
Strife felt a humming warmth seep into his back, and he relaxed a little.
Thank you.
He heard cloth ripping behind him now. I'll see if I can bind it.
As long as I can still use my bow.
How many arrows did he have left? 18? 19 maybe?
How's the arrow you pulled out? Still usable?
Would you like a scented pillow to lie on as well? Myrion wrapped the makeshift bandage around Strife's stomach, looping it under his arm.
That's more your style, Magister.
Strife winced as the bandage tugged tight.
You're not bad at this. Had to bind up your slaves after some blood ritual. I don't even own slaves, you knife-eared idiot.
Strife turned, raising an eyebrow.
What kind of magister did I end up shackled to?
I'm not a magister, Myrion glared, his eyebrows about the only thing Strife could make out in the darkness. Then sighed and shook his head. Magisters come from important families. My family was slaves. I only became a citizen because after my magic came, the owner of the factory where we worked adopted me into his family. He swallowed. I'm nobody. You know the glowing lamps in the street of Ventus? I light those with magic. That's my job. Strife stretched carefully. He'd be able to shoot.
Can I tell you a secret?
He got back to his feet and found them steady beneath him again.
I grew up in an alienage in Starkhaven.
I thought you were Dalish, Myrion said.
I had a big mouth, and it got me in trouble,
Strife said, smiling.
Hard to believe, I know. I hit a guard who was beating elven children, and he came back with more guards, and I ended up living in the woods. The Dalish found me and let me join up with them. I've picked up what I can from them, but...
Myrion started to laugh. You're nobody too.
Strife grinned. Well, we've only a few hours left, and I've got more than a dozen arrows in my quiver.
He looked at the darkened sky.
The Qunari are close behind us. It's probably too much to hope that the Guardian kills them all.
Myrion sighed. Your friend said she'd be back by midnight. You think we can stay ahead of them for that long?
I don't know, Strife admitted. With my injuries and your
complete ineptitude with all things related to the damned forest? Myrion finished. Strife laughed.
Lack of familiarity, let's say.
He squinted, then continued soberly.
No, we'll manage for a few hours, but they're going to catch us.
Well then, Myrion offered him a hand. Let's make them regret it. When the fourth Qunari guard fell under the forest guardian's blades, the Huntmaster decided it was time to act. As Bastar and his guards hacked at the thing, the Huntmaster put away his bow and readied his long spear. He stepped forward, feet light on the ground, pace unhurried, and watched as the forest guardian moved. Its blades swung swiftly, but with a regular pattern, and he paused for a moment, waited. His spear snaked through the whirling blades and struck the creature where its neck would be if it had one, the broad point punching through the stone. The guardian staggered, and Bastar and his guards hacked at the creature's legs as it turned to the Huntmaster, its blades flashing red in the sunset light. He stepped to one side, and a blade hissed by. A tiny movement of his spear sent another blade to the side harmlessly. Then he struck again, lunging in with the full force of his weight behind his thrust. His spear punched through the hole left by his first strike, and the guardian shuddered. Whatever magic inside the creature that gave it life, his spear had struck it, and the guardian collapsed, arm blades still twitching. The idiot guards kept hacking at them.
Enough!
The Huntmaster snapped.
Must ensure the creature is destroyed,
Bastar yelled, bringing his great blade down and shearing off one of the blades. The Huntmaster stalked forward and grabbed Bastar by the shoulder. We would not have needed to fight it had your guards not attacked it. Bastar pulled free from the Huntmaster's grip.
It is an unnatural beast. It is a waste of our time.
The Huntmaster stared at the log where the mage and the archer had taken cover.
This creature is unknown to the Qun, and our quarry has gone deeper into the forest.
He shook his head.
We should let them go. What? Why?
The Huntmaster turned to Bastar, whose face was a mask of outrage.
This is a flawed hunt. There is too much we do not understand. What do you need to understand?
Bastar pointed at where the mage and the archer had fled.
They are boss. My boss. You hunt them, we kill them. One is an elf, the Huntmaster corrected. He treads lightly in this forest, despite being captured in the city. This forest carries old magic. We do not know. But the elf knows it. We should come back with more guards plus a shard, who are better in the woods. Vashidan.
Bastar wiped grime from his great blade.
As long as I command the prison workers, you answer to me.
One of the guards, there were only 7 left, stood before him awkwardly, and he turned and snapped.
What? Bastar, the guard said hesitantly. One of our number is too injured to continue. He needs a healer.
The Huntmaster looked at the fallen guard, whose face was a mask of stoic pain for all the blood that steeped from an ugly stomach wound. A moment later, Bastar's sword cut the injured guard down.
Not anymore, Bastar said. Now, move.
He stumped off after the escaped prisoners, the cowed guards in tow. The Huntmaster looked for a long moment at the dead guard, and then he too followed Bastar deeper into the forest. The moon had risen, casting its pale light down through the branches onto the forest floor, when Myrion and Strife had heard the crash of footsteps in the distance behind them again. They had moved as quickly as they could, the now filthy chain catching on roots and rocks hidden by the darkness. But Strife's injuries slowed him down, and Myrion was too tired to push them any faster. At one point after he'd tripped, Strife had hauled them up, and they'd kept going with arms over each other's shoulders. Inside foot, outside, inside, outside. When do we turn and fight? Myrion asked, panting with effort.
Just a little farther,
Strife said. When you see a dead tree that looks like a pointing hand, head left. Got it. They kept moving. The crash of metal on branches grew louder behind them. If this were open ground, Myrion would probably be able to see them if he turned around. How long before they were seen? Ahead of them through a clearing, a small hill loomed, perhaps 10 feet high, mossy and steep. Just in front of it, a fallen tree jutted out, its twisting branches looking uncannily like grasping fingers, with one pointing. There, Strife muttered, and Myrion turned to the left. He found himself scrambling up a natural staircase made from tree roots. His sandaled feet slipped on the slick moss, but Strife caught him. In a moment they were up at the top of the hill Myrion had seen before. They now looked down at the path where they had just come from. Now, we stand and fight. Myrion nodded. I doubt that Qunari will see the steps in the darkness. Vira Dylan, said Strife, and grinned, his teeth flashing white in the moonlight. Way of the woods. Receive the gifts of the hunt with mindfulness. Normally that means the food you catch and eat. In this case, the gift of the hunt is me knowing about this little hill. Wisdom from your lady of the hunt. Perhaps your gods are good for something. Myrion began to pull the magic to him. It came in fast and strong with no hint of the danger he'd felt before the forest guardian had come. In his best aristocratic accent, he added, "I'll make a note to have my slaves apologize for doubting her." Strife laughed beside him and knocked an arrow.
"You're not so bad, Magister."
"Same to you, Nyfia." The Qunari came out into the clearing, and Strife let his first arrow fly. It sank into a guard's shoulder, and he howled in pain and staggered back. Myrion let his magic loose, and lightning snaked out, catching a pair of Qunari who collapsed, shaking. An arrow hissed past his cheek, and he ducked back, dimly catching a glimpse of the Huntmaster at the edge of the woods. Strife already had another arrow out and flying, and then another, his hands blurring as he loosed his shots. Guards came forward, roaring in anger and pain. Some of them fell, but not enough. Myrion focused, and a cloud wreathed in lightning flickered into existence at the base of the hill. The Qunari inside cried out as tendrils of light coiled around them, and Strife sent another tumbling to the ground, an arrow in his throat. Then a meaty hand came over the lip of the hilltop, just inches from Myrion's face. He leaped back in surprise, then staggered as a jagged impact slammed into him, and he looked down to see blood seeping from his right arm, where an arrow had grazed him. The hand pulled, as Boss Tar came up over the edge. In his other hand he held his massive axe.
"Boss!"
he roared, smiling savagely, and ripped Strife's bow from his grasp with a backhand blow that left Strife on the ground, stunned, or worse.
"You led us a good chase, but now you see that none escaped the Antam."
It was done. Myrion kneeled down to Strife, who was curled up and unmoving. He grabbed the elf's hand, now standing before them. Boss Tar was laughing, and the other Qunari in the clearing were starting to climb. Then Strife, still down, squeezed Myrion's hand once. The pain in his arm made Myrion queasy, but he held on. "Stupid Oxman," he snapped, rising slowly to his feet. "You cannot kill me. Look at me." He raised his uninjured arm, sneering in the moonlight with an arrogance to match Boss Tar's. "How many of your gods did we kill? Do you know what you did when you chained us together, Bastard?" Boss Tar brought his axe up under Myrion's chin.
"What is that, little boss?"
"You taught us to work as one," Myrion said, and then added, "Inside foot," and kicked out as Strife did the same. The shackle that bound Myrion's leg to Strife's caught Boss Tar just above the ankles, and the big Qunari crashed to the ground with Myrion beneath him, his axe falling away into the darkness. Myrion pushed, and Strife kicked, and Boss Tar slipped, rolling onto his back as he tried to halt his slide down the clearing.
"Now, the chain!"
Strife yelled, and as Boss Tar slid off Myrion, Strife leaped over, coming down on the other side and pulling the chain across Boss Tar's neck.
"Pull!"
Myrion heaved as Boss Tar's weight tore at his shackled leg. The giant Qunari had his hands up, grasping at the chain around his throat, and Myrion saw his legs kicking freely as he dangled over the hilltop's edge. But it wasn't going to be enough. Myrion's cloud of lightning had faded away, and other Qunari were already climbing up. They would free their commander and kill him. Myrion scrabbled at the soft earth to keep Boss Tar's weight from pulling him over the edge. All his and Strife's work, all their pain. And it had been for nothing. Boss Tar gave a strangled shout, clawing at the soft dirt with one hand and the chain around his throat with the other. A pair of Qunari reached the top of the hill, pulling themselves up. They towered over Myrion, their axes shining in the moonlight like bones. Then, a snowy white owl drifted overhead, a ghostly form in the moonlight. It landed between Myrion and Strife. "And that's midnight," Strife said with satisfaction. The air around the owl shimmered, and then suddenly it roared at the Qunari and swatted one with a great claw that ripped through the armor and flesh, sending the Qunari flying from the hilltop down to the clearing below. The other Qunari swung his axe, but the bear caught the haft of the weapon in its mouth and shattered it in his jaws. A moment later, another clawed swipe sent the warrior tumbling down into the clearing as well, and the bear roared with all the fury of the forest behind it.
Huntmaster!
Bastar shouted, his legs still kicking as he grasped at the chain around his throat.
Do your duty! Destroy those who threaten the Qun! Yes, called the Huntmaster. That's the idea. Bastard!
A sudden shocked silence washed across the clearing as the Huntmaster tossed his bow aside.
Antam! To me!
Bastar choked out.
I am not Antam!
The Huntmaster smiled as the Qunari beside him looked at him in confusion. In one fluid motion, he swung the spear down from his back and hurled it across the clearing. Bastar shuddered as the spear struck, then went silent and still. Now weaponless, the Huntmaster raised his hands, and then, as though they stood at a fancy ball, he placed a hand across his waist and bowed politely, his stoic expression melting into a polite smile beneath the face paint.
I am Sabrak of the Ban Hasrath,
he said, and the other Qunari scrambled away, turning their backs on Myrion and Strife and the bear, as though he were suddenly the greatest threat.
I heard rumors,
he said, walking forward and looking to the Qunari in the clearing,
that the Antam who took Ventus did not act in accordance with the Qun.
He sounded disappointed.
Some of the boss now call us monsters.
He gestured up at Myrion and the others on the hilltop.
And they are not wrong. This is what threatens the Qun. Has ibalavarad nara,
he said, as he pulled his spear from Bastar's body.
For those I watch, of which I am one.
He held his spear loosely, not raised but ready if needed. The bear shimmered in the air and became Irelin, her furs and leather sparkling in the moonlight as she looked down at the Qunari. Go and live, Sabrak of the Ben Hasrath, she said. This is not your place. Sabrak nodded. He picked up his bow and raised it in a brief salute.
I was better with the spear than I was with this.
Seemed like a good shot to me, Strife called back, holding his injured stomach.
I was aiming for your arm.
Sabrak grinned and placed the great bow carefully back on the ground.
Good luck.
He stepped back into the forest with a stern look at the other Qunari, and they followed him, heads down and shoulders bowed. In moments, the clearing held only Myrion, Strife, Irelin, and Bastar's corpse. Strife shuffled forward and lifted his leg, and with a groaning clink of metal, Bastar's body slid free and tumbled down the steep slope to crash at the bottom.
Cut it a little close, lass.
She gave him a look. It is as little as 2 hours before midnight. You're lucky I came at all. Strife laughed.
Fair enough. I don't suppose you remembered to bring the lockpick.
I was in a hurry, she shrugged. We can still cut the human's foot off. Myrion blanched, but Strife just laughed again.
Maybe I can shoot it off with the bow he left me.
As though you could even draw that thing, Irelin said, rolling her eyes. It's as tall as you are.
It may require a bit of practice,
Strife said, and limped over to Bastar's massive axe. He lifted it with both hands.
This will do for now, then. Myrion, you're going to want to stay very, very still.
Myrion lay back, trying to ignore the throbbing of his injured arm.
Not a problem.
It took 3 great blows, each of which sent painful reverberations up Myrion's leg, but finally, the bolt on his shackle snapped. Strife staggered back, the shackle trailing behind him and rattling in the grass. He dropped the axe and stretched out his back.
Oh, finally!
Myrion stretched his leg, shaking the broken shackle free. Try not to miss me too much. Strife laughed.
I think I've gotten my exercise for the day. Irelin, if you wouldn't mind making camp, we can rest up, then head back to the clan in the morning.
What about him? Irelin asked, pointing at Myrion. I know. This isn't my place either. Myrion waved it away. Let me get my arm bandaged and a night's rest, and I'll be on my way. Strife clapped him on the shoulder, the one without the injured arm. You're right, Shem. This isn't your place. But then, once upon a time, it wasn't mine either. Myrion smiled up at the older elf hesitantly. He wasn't sure exactly what morning would hold. But at least he'd be there to see it.